The city glowed beneath them like a net of gold veins. Inside the glass-top restaurant, every reflection trembled, crystal, chrome, and pride. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Vance, the billionaire CEO who built a global tech empire and spoke less than anyone in the room. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a wall. Around her, 10 men in dark suits mistook it for arrogance. They filled the air with laughter that echoed too loud against the marble. The room smelled faintly of citrus polish and expensive fear. Each guest believed they understood power. They watched Eleanor's stillness like an equation they couldn't solve. When she raised her water glass, cameras from the corporate PR team tilted up, catching the angle of her wrist. Everything about the dinner, the menu, the seating, even the napkin folds, had been rehearsed. Only silence hadn't. At the far edge of the table, Naomi Reed, the waitress, moved like a shadow that glowed. Her uniform was plain, but her gaze was sharp. She spoke little and listened more. The guests never looked at her face long enough to see the quiet intelligence behind her careful movements. The contrast was sharp. Eleanor's world of titanium decisions against Naomi's world of folded linens. But both women understood performance. The evening began with applause, a staged welcome for the foreign investors who had flown in from London, New York, and Seoul. The translator, a young man with perfect hair and restless eyes, stood beside Eleanor like a decorative lamp. He turned her brief sentences into paragraphs, and her nods into praise. No. One noticed her jaw tighten when he spoke. The investors complimented her composure, her discipline, her mystique. They didn't realize they were describing their own distance from her. In the mirror walls, the city lights looked like another audience. Naomi drifted closer with a tray of champagne. She caught the rhythm of conversation, broken English, half-remembered Japanese phrases, the hum of competition. She didn't need subtitles. She understood tone, the bragging laughter that tried to sound warm but carried teeth. She also noticed Eleanor's eyes, steady, watchful, lonely. One of the older executives, red-faced from wine, rose to give a toast. He wanted to impress her by using her mother's language. The translator leaned toward him, uneasy. Eleanor's posture changed, not visibly, but the air around her thinned. Naomi stopped pouring and listened. The executive raised his glass and stumbled through a few Japanese words he had memorized on the flight. They were meant to honor Eleanor's heritage, but his pronunciation twisted a name, her late mother's name, into something crude. The translator smiled nervously and rendered it as, "to the spirit of resilience." Laughter followed. Forks clicked against plates. Nobody noticed the tremor in Eleanor's hand as she set her glass down without drinking. Naomi understood every syllable. Her chest tightened. She looked at Eleanor. The CEO's face was calm, but her eyes had gone still, like deep water before a storm. The translator went on, smoothing the mistake, pretending nothing had happened. Eleanor gave a polite nod. The investors clapped, unaware they had stepped on sacred ground. The music swelled again, a jazz trio softening the moment. Yet something invisible had cracked in the air. Naomi saw it. She could feel the moral weight of the silence, the way a single wrong word could carry centuries of misunderstanding. Outside, Tokyo shimmered, pretending not to see. Eleanor lifted her glass once more, but this time she didn't drink. She only stared through the reflection of herself in the table's mirrored surface, a woman surrounded by brilliance and blindness. In the corner, Naomi whispered the correct translation under her breath, as if the truth itself needed rescuing. That was the moment the night began to turn. The toast, mistranslated and uncorrected, had already changed everything. The next morning, the city woke bright and busy, but Eleanor Vance's world stayed quiet. She stood before a hotel window that reached the clouds, her reflection faint against the light. To everyone else, her silence at last night's dinner had been power, the kind that made people shrink or perform. But the truth was simpler and far sadder. Her silence had once been survival. Eleanor had learned that lesson as a girl in Osaka. Her mother's voice, soft, quick, always switching between languages, filled their small apartment like music. Her mother taught her to fold paper cranes and to bow before speaking. Words are tools, she would say. But silence is a weapon when you're not allowed to fight. That weapon became Eleanor's shield. When her mother died, the world's sounds turned hollow. The market sellers, the train brakes, the hum of the rain, all reminders of what she'd lost. Her father, a restless English engineer, returned to London, leaving her between two languages and belonging to neither. Eleanor was 12 when she stopped speaking Japanese. By 15, she had stopped crying. She learned that silence made people project whatever they needed to see. Confidence, mystery, control. She let them. Years later, when she entered boardrooms filled with men who mispronounced her name, her silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. Investors called her disciplined. Journalists called her cold. She called it efficient. Now in the polished glass of the Tokyo hotel, that same composure stared back at her. Precise posture, pale suit, eyes unreadable. The world thought it saw confidence. Only she could feel the cost. The sound of a news report flickered from the small TV across the room. A journalist discussed the dinner. Eleanor Vance, the elusive CEO, hosted foreign investors at Skyglass Tower. Sources described her as calm and unshakable. Unshakable. The word clanged in her chest. She turned away from the screen. Her assistant knocked, announcing the next round of meetings. Eleanor nodded, wordless, and adjusted her cufflinks. They were silver, shaped like small cranes, the only jewelry she ever wore, a secret memory she carried into every battle. Later that evening, she returned to the same restaurant for a follow-up meeting. The room was full again. The same laughter, the same surface charm. Only she knew what had cracked beneath it. As she entered, the whispers began. The men spoke in English, careful but careless. Fragments of gossip wrapped in polite tones. She looked offended, one said. Or maybe she didn't understand. Another replied, hard to tell with her. Maybe that's her strategy. They thought she couldn't hear. They were wrong. Eleanor caught every word, each one a soft echo of her past. The years when her accent was mocked, her quietness mistaken for ignorance. She said nothing. Instead, she poured herself a cup of tea, her hand steady, her expression carved from calm. The conversation thinned. The guests began to notice the weight of her silence again, how it absorbed the room, how it pressed against their small talk like gravity. Silence had once been her mother's lesson, then her weapon. Now, it was her language, the one no one else could translate. As the laughter dimmed and the city lights trembled through the glass walls, Eleanor's silence filled the space more completely than sound ever could. It was not emptiness. It was everything she had ever refused to lose. Her badge said Naomi, but her passport said Naomiya. In the kitchen, they called her by whichever name was easier to pronounce. She never corrected them. To the staff, she was the quiet waitress who never dropped a glass, who understood every order before it was spoken. To the guests, she was invisible. That invisibility was her greatest advantage. Naomi had studied words all her life, how they built walls and how they broke them. Back in Boston, she had been a rising linguistics scholar, fluent in 6 languages and fluent, too, in disappointment. A committee once told her she was too opinionated for a translator and too foreign for tenure. The polite phrases still echoed. She left academia with nothing but notebooks full of observations. She called her private project the language of power. The rule was simple. Watch how people speak when they believe they're safe. Now she worked at elite dinners in Tokyo, where money and confidence sounded the same in any language. Inside the glass restaurant, she moved like part of the background, the steady rhythm between crystal and silver. But her mind recorded everything, accents, hesitation, tone. She knew when a word was used as a bridge and when it was used as a blade. At the far end of the long table sat Eleanor Vance, the billionaire who said almost nothing. Naomi had served her before. Most guests performed their importance. Eleanor didn't. Her silence wasn't arrogance, it was armor. Naomi recognized it instantly. It was the same armor she wore every day in plain clothes. Tonight, Naomi watched as the dinner turned into a performance of misunderstanding. The executives spoke in loud English, seasoning their words with fragments of Japanese they didn't truly know. The translator smiled too much. The laughter in the room felt staged. Naomi placed a dish on the table and paused just long enough to hear a sentence that froze her. "Maybe she doesn't understand us," one executive said. "Maybe she's pretending." Another chuckled. his accent heavy as he added a phrase in Japanese, a misused, twisted version of quiet woman. The words landed like a bruise. Naomi's hand tightened on the serving tray. They didn't know what they had said. They didn't know they had insulted Eleanor in the very language they tried to mimic. For a second, Naomi wanted to speak, to correct them, to defend the woman who sat at the center of the noise like a calm storm. But she didn't. She kept moving, silent as training taught her to be. Still inside, her thoughts burned. She understood the sharp edge behind the laughter. She had heard it before. In faculty lounges, in job interviews, in rooms where she was both needed and dismissed. Words could humiliate as quietly as a whisper. As Naomi walked past Eleanor, their eyes met for half a second. Neither woman spoke, but the look was enough. One understood the insult. The other understood the pain. The executives kept laughing, unaware that their broken Japanese had already revealed more about them than any contract ever could. And in that moment, Naomi knew the dinner was no longer about business. It had become a lesson in translation, not of language, but of dignity. The first mistake was made with a smile. A senior executive, gray suit, gold watch, and the confidence of someone who'd never been corrected, stood to give his toast. He raised his glass high, proud to honor the global partnership between his firm and Eleanor Vance's empire. Cameras turned toward him. Every surface in the glass-top restaurant gleamed like a stage light. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate the woman who shows the world what discipline and elegance mean." Applause. A pause. Then, wanting to impress her, he switched languages. "In memory of her roots," he said, turning toward Eleanor, "let us say this in Japanese." The translator froze. Naomi Reed, standing near the table with a tray of wine, felt her stomach tighten. The executive squinted, recalling his rehearsed line. He spoke a phrase he had copied from a language app, words meant to praise Eleanor's late mother. But in his clumsy tone, one syllable slipped. The vowel dragged, the name twisted. In Japanese, it no longer meant grace. It meant burden. Naomi's breath caught. The room stayed bright and expectant. Nobody else noticed. The translator blinked hard, then recovered. He smiled at Eleanor and translated smoothly into English. To the mother who taught strength and kindness. Laughter, more applause, relief. But Naomi heard the wound hiding under the noise. The insult had floated past like perfume. Invisible, untraceable, unforgettable. Eleanor's hand did not move. Her expression stayed carved from glass. Only the small pulse in her neck betrayed that she'd understood. Naomi looked at her, then at the translator. He avoided Eleanor's eyes, pretending the moment had never happened. The executives raised their glasses, repeating the distorted phrase, their accents flattening it further. Each repetition turned the mistake into mockery, though none of them knew it. Naomi's thoughts spun. She had spent years studying words, how one wrong sound could twist meaning in history. Now she was watching that lesson play out in real time. Eleanor raised her glass but didn't drink. The music began again, a soft, polite piano melody. Waiters moved with trained smiles. Naomi felt her throat tighten. She wanted to step forward, to correct the translation, to defend what had been desecrated without intent. But she was staff, not guest. To speak would mean crossing a line that could cost her the job she barely survived on. And yet silence felt like betrayal. She glanced at Eleanor again. Their eyes met across the table, one brief, electric second. In Eleanor's gaze, Naomi saw not anger but recognition. The look said, "You heard it too." Naomi froze, her heart pounding against the tray she carried. Around them, laughter carried on, shallow and confident, while truth sat between two women who understood what could never be said aloud. The translator clapped for the toast, pretending to celebrate his own recovery. The executive beamed, proud of his effort to honor her heritage. But Eleanor stayed still. She placed her glass down without a sip. Naomi turned away before anyone saw the emotion rising in her eyes. She moved toward the back, steps measured, breath sharp, every word, every misstep of the toast, replayed in her mind like a warning. At the table, Eleanor's reflection wavered in the wine glass, a face framed by power, shadowed by memory, and across the room Naomi stood motionless, holding the truth like something fragile and burning. wondering if silence was mercy or cowardice. She hadn't yet decided which. It began with silence so sharp it could cut glass. Eleanor Vance sat motionless at the head of the table, her fingers resting lightly on the stem of her untouched wine glass. Around her, the executive's laughter cracked and sputtered, trying to fill the air that her stillness had emptied. The mistranslated toast lingered like smoke, invisible, choking, inescapable. No one dared mention it, yet everyone felt it. The wrong word had hung between them, staining the night. The translator smiled too brightly. The host pretended ignorance. Only Eleanor and Naomi understood the truth beneath the performance. The restaurant's high glass walls shimmered with the city's glow. Outside, Tokyo glittered, disciplined and endless. Inside, the table looked like a mirror of it, bright surfaces hiding fractures beneath. Eleanor lifted her glass, turning it slowly. Her reflection distorted in the curve of the crystal. That was how they saw her, warped by misunderstanding, refracted by expectation. Across the room, Naomi stood with her tray, the cool metal pressing against her palms. She could feel the tension ripple through the guests, like a storm that everyone pretended not to see. Their laughter became small, their voices cautious. Even the music from the jazz trio seemed to falter, unsure of its place. Then came the whispers. "She didn't like the toast," one executive muttered in English. "She's too sensitive," another replied. "Maybe she didn't even understand it," said a third too loudly. Eleanor heard them, every syllable. But her posture didn't change. Stillness had always been her weapon, yet tonight even she could feel the edges of her control slipping. Naomi set down her tray and glanced at her. Their eyes met again, brief, wordless, heavy with meaning. The translator leaned toward Eleanor, speaking softly. "Perhaps, Ms. Vance, we move on to the dessert?" Her answer was measured, almost cold. "No!" The words sliced through the noise. Every conversation stopped. Eleanor's gaze swept the table. The men shifted in their seats, caught between apology and pride. She could have corrected the insult, could have educated them. But that would mean lowering herself into their ignorance, something she had sworn never to do again. The tension became unbearable. Naomi's breath grew shallow. Her training said to stay invisible. Her conscience said otherwise. A waiter reached for an empty wine bottle and bumped the stem of a glass. It tipped, rolled, and fell. The crash was sudden, bright, final. A perfect, terrible sound. The glass shattered across the floor, scattering reflections of the chandelier like broken stars. Everyone froze. Eleanor's eyes followed the shards. Her silence, once powerful, now felt fragile. Around her, the illusion of civility cracked open. The translator stammered. The executives looked down, guilty without knowing why. In that split second, Naomi felt something shift inside her, a clarity stronger than fear. She realized that the broken glass was not an accident. It was a signal. The mask of politeness had shattered. What remained was truth. Her heart pounded, but her voice found itself. "Excuse me," she said, softly at first, then stronger. "Excuse me." Every head turned toward her. A waitress speaking at a corporate table was not part of the script. Naomi set her tray aside, her hands trembling slightly. She took a breath that seemed to pull the whole room still. And then she spoke, clear, steady, fluent, in Japanese. The executives blinked, confused. Eleanor's eyes widened, the faintest flicker of surprise cutting through her composure. The night that had begun with a mistranslation had just met its first true voice, and the sound of broken glass still glittered at their feet. The silence after Naomi spoke was not empty, it was alive. Every head turned toward her. The executives blinked, their practiced smiles stiffening. The translator froze mid-breath. The sound of the broken glass still glittered faintly on the marble floor, but no one dared move. Naomi's voice trembled only once, then steadied. "If I may," she said, switching from English to Japanese with the grace of someone returning home. The phrase used in the toast, it was not a compliment. It replaced your mother's name with a word that means burden. "I thought, you should know." The words fell softly, but the truth landed like thunder. The translator's face went pale. "That's not what was intended," he stammered. "It was just an accent mistake." Naomi turned to him, her tone calm but unyielding. Intent doesn't erase meaning. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier laughter now felt like evidence. The older executive who had given the toast looked as if he had swallowed his own voice. His hand shook slightly as he set his glass down. Eleanor said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on Naomi, sharp, searching, and impossibly still. For the first time all evening, her silence was not a wall. It was a bridge. Naomi continued, quieter now. "In Japan, words about the dead are sacred. To twist them, even by accident, is to dishonor what cannot defend itself." She looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I am sorry to speak out of turn, but silence would have been worse." The translator began to apologize again, but Eleanor raised a hand. The gesture was small, precise, final. The room obeyed. She rose slowly from her chair. The soft rustle of her suit was the only sound. Every eye followed her, waiting for anger, humiliation, or some grand rebuke. But Eleanor's face revealed none of those things. Her calm returned like a tide, not weakness but mastery. "Thank you," she said, in flawless Japanese. Naomi's head lifted in surprise. Their eyes met. Two women who had lived entire lives misread by others, now seeing each other clearly for the first time. The interpreter looked lost. The executives looked smaller, their authority shrinking under the weight of their own ignorance. Eleanor continued, still in Japanese. "My mother believed that language is a mirror. It shows not just who we are, but how we see others. Tonight the mirror has cracked. Perhaps that is necessary." No one spoke. The translator's notebook slipped from his hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Naomi bowed slightly, unsure whether to stay or leave. Eleanor gave the faintest nod. Permission, acknowledgement, gratitude. A waiter appeared at the edge of the room, hesitant to interrupt. The air itself seemed cautious, as if afraid to make noise. The executives fidgeted, realizing how loud their success had sounded minutes ago, and how hollow it was now. The city's lights shimmered against the glass walls, 1,000 silent witnesses to what had changed inside. Eleanor turned back to the table. Her voice, when it returned to English, was even and clear. "The meal is over," she said, "but the lesson should stay." She left her untouched wine on the table, the liquid trembling slightly in its glass, unbroken, reflective, whole. Naomi stood where she was, her pulse steadying, her hands no longer shaking. For the first time that night, the room no longer belonged to power. It belonged to conscience. The room emptied like a tide pulling back from shore. Executives hurried out with lowered heads. The translator gathered his papers in silence, and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen replaced the false laughter that had once filled the air. Only Eleanor Vance and Naomi Reed remained, two women from opposite worlds bound now by one act of truth. Eleanor stood by the glass wall, her reflection lit by the city below. The skyscrapers glimmered like circuitry, her empire stretching out into the dark. For years she had built everything on control, on the discipline to say nothing when words could be twisted. But Naomi's voice had pierced that fortress. "Sit," Eleanor said quietly. "Please." Naomi hesitated, unsure if she was being dismissed or honored. Then she pulled out a chair and sat, folding her hands in her lap. The restaurant around them seemed to breathe again, slower, calmer. Eleanor turned from the window. "You speak Japanese beautifully," she said. Naomi met her gaze. "My mother was Jamaican. My father taught languages at Kyoto University. I grew up between accents. I never really fit anywhere." She smiled faintly, the kind that carried a lifetime behind it. "I used to translate at academic conferences. People liked my work until they heard my voice. They said my tone didn't sound neutral enough." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Neutral," she repeated. "That's what they call silence when it serves them." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the city filled the space where shame and empathy now lived side by side. Then Eleanor said softly, "I haven't spoken Japanese in 20 years." Naomi looked up. Why? Eleanor exhaled, her words measured. When my mother died, I was told to move forward, to learn the language of money, not memory. So I did. But every word I built my company on was a kind of translation. I told the world what it wanted to hear. Naomi's eyes softened. And tonight? Tonight, Eleanor said, someone finally told me the truth, in my own tongue. The two women sat in silence again, but this time it was a shared silence. Not a wall, but a peace. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tracing lines down the glass like handwriting. A waiter approached timidly. "Madam, would you like another glass of wine?" Eleanor glanced at the half-finished bottle. The rich red liquid caught the light, the color of power, spectacle, and every mask she had ever worn. "No," she said. "Tea." The waiter blinked, then nodded and left. Naomi watched her, sensing the meaning behind the choice. In Japan, tea was not a drink. It was a ceremony, quiet, deliberate, respectful. It demanded presence, not performance. When the cup arrived, steam rose between them like a signal of calm. Eleanor lifted it carefully, her fingers steady. "To honesty," she said. Naomi smiled. "To understanding." They drank in silence, the taste simple and pure. Outside, the city lights flickered against the rain, and for the first time that night, nothing needed to be translated. The spectacle was over. Ceremony had returned. The headline broke with the sunrise. Billionaire CEO rebukes racist toast, interpreter exposed. By 8 o'clock, the story had already circled the globe. News anchors analyzed the footage. Commentators dissected every word. And social media split into two armies. Those who called it courage and those who called it scandal. But Eleanor Vance said nothing. Her publicist begged for a statement. Her board demanded one. She refused. Words had already done enough harm. Instead, she made a quiet call to her financial office and gave a single instruction. Create a fund. Name it after Naomi Reed. The transfer went through within hours. A scholarship for bilingual women in leadership, aimed at those who moved between languages and worlds, never fully seen in either. Eleanor's only comment in the memo was one line, "For those who speak truth in more than one tongue." By noon, the noise grew louder. Talk shows replayed the dinner clip. Eleanor's calm face, Naomi's trembling voice, the frozen executives. Experts debated whether the CEO's silence had been dignity or defiance. But in a quiet corner of the city, Naomi sat at a cafe that opened early for workers like her. The air smelled of roasted beans and rain. Her phone buzzed with messages she hadn't answered. When she finally looked at the headline, she didn't smile. She scrolled past the debates, past the speculation. Then she saw the small line buried deep in a business column. Sources confirm the creation of a private fund, the Naomi Reed Fellowship, established personally by Eleanor Vance. Her hands shook. Not from shock, but from recognition. The gesture was not charity. It was acknowledgement, a translation of gratitude into action. Naomi looked out the window. Morning light struck the wet street, turning every puddle into glass. For a moment, she saw her own reflection beside the city's ordinary. But finally seen, she whispered one word, soft enough that only the steam from her cup seemed to hear it. Arigato. The cafe stayed quiet. The world still noisy beyond its door. But somewhere in a skyscraper high above, Eleanor's computer screen went dark after the final confirmation. She closed her eyes, not in victory but in peace. 2 women, 2 languages, 1 act of understanding. The story had already been told. The meaning no longer needed translation. The city had forgotten, but Eleanor Vance had not. Months after the dinner that changed her reputation and her silence, she returned to the same glass-top restaurant high above Tokyo. The skyline looked identical, bright and distant, as if nothing important had ever happened beneath it. Inside, the place had been restored, the shattered wine glass replaced, the marble floor polished smooth again. The same music played, calm, polite, practiced, yet the air carried something invisible, like the echo of a truth once spoken. Eleanor walked toward the table that had once been her battlefield. It gleamed as before, flawless under the light, but she could still see where the cracks had been. Memory made them visible. The waiter, a young man who didn't recognize her, asked softly, "Would you like your usual table, madam?" She nodded. He pulled out a chair, the same spot where Naomi Reed had once stood, voice trembling, truth rising from the silence like a song no one expected. Eleanor sat down, her movements measured. The table reflected her face in perfect symmetry, yet it no longer felt like a mirror of power. It felt like a reminder. She ordered tea. The same ritual as that night, but now it meant something different. The cup arrived steaming calm, complete. She lifted it gently, remembering the waitress who had taught her that some forms of courage arrive in quiet voices. Outside, the city pulsed with commerce and light, a machine that never paused for reflection. But inside, Eleanor let herself breathe. Naomi's scholarship program had already begun. Letters from young bilingual women arrived every week. Daughters of immigrants, students of language, dreamers who lived between words. They thanked Eleanor for opportunity, but Eleanor knew who the gratitude belonged to. She glanced once more at the glass tabletop. In its sheen, her reflection blurred, and for a fleeting moment she saw another beside it. Naomi's not literal, but true. Two faces, one vision. The woman who led with silence, and the woman who broke it. Light from the afternoon sun struck the table, passing clean through the glass, through both of their mirrored images. And Eleanor understood. Some people lead the world by speaking, others by listening, but the rarest are those who see.